There's a small village in East Java, Indonesia, where life used to be simple and quiet. Families had lived there for generations, growing crops, raising children, and building a future. But in 2006, that future was swallowed by a river of mud. It began suddenly, with the earth shaking and a loud explosion. From deep below, mud burst forth, flooding homes, schools, and farmlands. It wasn't a natural disaster, it was triggered by drilling for natural gas. Since that day, the mud hasn't stopped flowing. It's covered 16 villages, displacing over 60,000 people. Families were forced to leave everything behind, watching their homes disappear under the mud, knowing they could never return. For nearly 2 decades, the mud has kept flowing, consuming the land little by little. It's a disaster few have heard of, but the lives it destroyed can never be forgotten. Far from Indonesia, in 1991, Kuwait was facing its own nightmare. During the Gulf War, Iraqi forces set fire to over 600 oil wells as they retreated. For months, the sky was black with thick, toxic smoke. The sun was blotted out, turning day into night, and the air became impossible to breathe. These fires weren't just massive, they were apocalyptic. The flames stretched for miles, and the burning oil spilled across the desert, destroying everything in its path. The fires released millions of tons of carbon dioxide and other toxic gases into the atmosphere, causing long-term damage to both the environment and the people living in the region. While the fires were eventually put out, the land still carries the scars, and the environment continues to feel the effects decades later. In the United States, there's another story, one that seemed quiet for years, until it wasn't. In the 1950s, a neighborhood was built in Niagara Falls, New York, called Love Canal. It was a typical American suburb filled with families and children, but buried beneath the ground was a dark secret. 21,000 tons of toxic chemical waste, left there by a chemical company years before. The waste began to seep into the soil, leaking into homes and schools, poisoning the air and water. Families started noticing strange illnesses. Children developed rashes, adults suffered from headaches and breathing problems, and birth defects became more common. By the 1970s, the truth came out, and Love Canal became the symbol of toxic waste disasters in America. The entire neighborhood had to be evacuated, leaving behind homes and lives that could never be reclaimed. Love Canal changed the way America looked at environmental protection, but the damage it caused is still felt by those who lived there. In Russia, the damage caused by toxic waste is even more extreme. Lake Karachay was once a peaceful body of water in the Soviet Union, but over decades, it became the dumping ground for nuclear waste. What was once a lake of life became a lake of death. The radiation levels in and around the lake were so high that standing near it for just an hour could kill a person. The water is so contaminated that even today, it remains one of the most polluted places on Earth. The Soviet Union kept the extent of the disaster hidden for years, but now it's known as one of the worst examples of radioactive pollution in history. The lake still sits there, a toxic time bomb, poisoning the land and the people nearby. Another hidden disaster lies in Central Asia, where the Aral Sea, once the 4th largest lake in the world, has almost entirely disappeared. In the 1960s, Soviet irrigation projects began diverting water from the rivers that fed the Aral Sea to grow cotton in the desert. Slowly, the sea began to shrink, leaving behind a salty, toxic desert. The once thriving fishing industry collapsed, and the people who depended on the lake for their livelihoods were left with nothing. But that wasn't the worst of it. As the water disappeared, toxic dust storms began sweeping through the region, spreading pollutants far and wide. The health of people living nearby deteriorated, with respiratory diseases becoming more common, and the local ecosystem was destroyed. Today, the Aral Sea is a shadow of what it once was, a stark reminder of what can happen when we tamper with nature on a massive scale. These are the environmental catastrophes most people have never heard about. The mudflows, fires, toxic waste, and vanishing lakes tell stories of lives forever changed and ecosystems destroyed. While the damage may not always be visible on the surface, these disasters have left deep scars on our planet, and their impact is still being felt today. Each of these stories shows us the fragile balance between human activity and the environment, and how quickly things can spiral out of control. They remind us that our actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are hidden until it's too late. Yet by telling these stories, we can learn from the past and push for a future where these kinds of disasters are avoided. Environmental catastrophes don't always make the headlines, but they matter. The people and ecosystems affected by these disasters deserve to be remembered, and their stories deserve to be told. In 1986, an environmental disaster unfolded in Germany that most of the world has long forgotten. A fire broke out at a chemical warehouse owned by Sandoz, located near Basel, Switzerland, but its effects would ripple far beyond Swiss borders. Firefighters used large amounts of water to extinguish the flames, inadvertently flushing 30 tons of toxic chemicals into the Rhine River, which flowed downstream into Germany. The Rhine was critical to the region's economy, providing drinking water, supporting industries, and sustaining local ecosystems. But within hours of the spill, the river became a toxic mess. Hundreds of thousands of fish died, and the once thriving riverbanks were littered with their bodies. The chemical contamination reached German cities like Düsseldorf, disrupting industries, agriculture, and communities that depended on the Rhine. Cleanup efforts were launched, but the damage was done. The river's ecosystem took years to recover, and some species never returned. The Sandoz disaster pushed Germany and other European countries to adopt stricter environmental laws, but the incident remains a dark chapter in the Rhine's history. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Japan faced its own environmental catastrophe in the 1950s. In the town of Minamata, residents began to notice unusual illnesses among people and animals. Cats exhibited strange behaviors, often twitching uncontrollably, while fishermen and their families showed symptoms of numbness, muscle weakness, and difficulty speaking. What was later called Minamata disease turned out to be mercury poisoning, caused by the Chiso Corporation's chemical waste dumping into Minamata Bay. The people of the town, unaware of the contamination, had been consuming fish from the polluted waters for years. The effects were devastating. Families were shattered as parents and children alike became gravely ill. In severe cases, the poisoning led to paralysis, brain damage, and death. The long fight for justice exposed deep flaws in Japan's industrial regulations, and though compensation was eventually given, the damage to the community was irreversible. The disease left lasting scars on the region, and Minamata became synonymous with industrial pollution and negligence. Both the Sandoz spill in Germany and the Minamata disease in Japan highlight the catastrophic impact of environmental neglect. These disasters continue to remind us of the importance of protecting our natural resources and prioritizing environmental health before it's too come to boo. In the heart of Europe, the Rhine River runs through Germany, a symbol of the country's natural beauty and industrial strength. But in 1986, this vital waterway was the scene of one of Germany's worst environmental disasters. A fire at a chemical warehouse owned by Sandoz, a Swiss company, released over 30 tons of toxic chemicals into the river. As firefighters battled the blaze, the contaminated water flowed downstream into Germany, turning parts of the Rhine into a toxic graveyard. Fish died in massive numbers, and entire ecosystems were decimated. For years after the spill, the once thriving river struggled to recover. Now, decades later, the Rhine is cleaner, thanks to aggressive cleanup efforts and international cooperation. But challenges remain. Just last year, in 2023, concerns about water pollution and drought resurfaced as industrial waste and climate change continue to affect the river's health. Germany's fight to protect the Rhine is ongoing, with stricter environmental regulations in place, yet the lesson of 1986 still looms large. The disaster led to a stronger commitment to protect shared natural resources, but it also serves as a reminder of the fragile balance between industry and nature. On the other side of the world, Japan's Minamata Bay tells a similarly tragic story. In the 1950s, residents of Minamata began to suffer from what became known as Minamata disease, caused by mercury poisoning. The Chiso Corporation had been dumping mercury-laden waste into the bay, and the local population, who relied on fishing, unknowingly consumed contaminated seafood. Over the years, thousands of people were affected, suffering from neurological disorders, paralysis, and even death. The impact was generational, with children born with severe deformities. Fast forward to 2023, Minamata still carries the scars of its past. Last year marked the 50th anniversary of the recognition of Minamata disease, a poignant reminder of Japan's dark environmental legacy. While much has been done to clean the waters and compensate victims, environmental activists argue that more work is needed to fully heal the community and prevent future disasters. In fact, recent environmental concerns over industrial waste disposal in other parts of Japan raise fears that history could repeat itself. Today, both Germany and Japan remain vigilant. While they've made significant progress in addressing environmental crises, the challenges are far from over. These disasters, from the Rhine to Minamata, remind us of the price we pay when the environment is neglected, and the work that remains to protect future generations.